This is a story from a few years back. I was in high school at the time, and my mother had just died unexpectedly during a car accident. And in order to get it off our mind, my father and I and a few of his friends took a trip down to the Copper River in interior Alaska. We lived in Fairbanks at the time. We drove down expecting to go dip netting. Go ahead and look it up if you're unsure what that entails. Once we reached the Copper River, we took a detour to go on the less traveled side of the river. This is where we would set up camp. We drove our four-wheelers down the winding dirt path that was right next to the river. Oftentimes, there would be a steep drop that would only be cushioned by the silty river. After settling far down the path, we all set up our tents and got ready to go. After a long day of dip netting, we called it a night and rode our four-wheelers back to our spot. There were no other occupied camping spots that we had seen, all of them simply being small clearings that barely cut into the dense woods that surrounded the river. You could maybe see 20 feet into the trees before it was simply darkness. We reach our camp and begin to settle down, discussing our bad luck with fishing. We had just begun to cook hot dogs when we heard a gunshot down the path we had just come. As I had said, we had saw no tents between where we were fishing and where we were camping. Our campsite faced the river with the trail in between, and to the left was a path to get back to civilization. To the right was simply wilderness. The gunshot was from the right. All four of us sit up, and Brian, one of my father's friends, suggests we check this out. We don't take our four-wheelers, we simply hike down the trail. This is due to it being very noisy and startling. Whoever shot that gun wasn't something I'd say would be a bright idea. Brian and Robert both carry guns, and my father and I follow behind. This sounds bad, but trust me, you don't want to be asleep with people shooting guns around in the Alaskan wilderness, or anywhere for that matter. After traveling down the trail for what felt like hours and seeing no one, we reached the tunnel that you must pass through in order to reach the good spots for dip netting. We can make out multiple figures on the other end of the tunnel, and they're all moving. They seem to be dancing next to a fire, waving what we assumed were weapons in the air. We hunched down around the edge of the tunnel, peering in. Brian suggests they must be drinking, and this seems like a logical assumption at the time. We talk about how we might approach them, telling them that it makes us uncomfortable and such for them to be shooting guns at this time of night. Sounds corny and very unrealistic of an expectation, but again, the Alaskan darkness that conceals all comers during the night feels unsafe enough as it is. We eventually reach the conclusion that we'll just set up camp farther away from them and not take the risk. As we head back along the trail, which is windy, we see glimmers of light scattered to the left. Headlights. We all duck into the bush, hiding. 2 trucks full of these teens pass us by, them screaming like banshees. Wait it out is what we did, and after a long time of just sitting there, sometimes talking quietly, barely audible over the sound of the small waterfall nearby, we decided to go back to our camp. When we get there, we see our tents torn down, our fire put out, our four-wheelers knocked over, and just overall disheveling of the entire campsite. We decide to hightail it the fuck out of there immediately. There's only one trail out, and they definitely didn't come back down the way they came from. This means they could only be between us and the way out. This is obvious to all of us, but fuck it, there's no way we can stay here. It was completely out of the question. We bundle everything together as quickly as possible, packing the torn down tents and attaching the coolers to the back of the four-wheelers, and we head out. The dirt path is tiny, and the truck could surely have run us off the road if they were to come down during our escape. Miraculously, we make it out of there without ever seeing those teens again. Needless to say, we haven't gone back to dip net there, nor will we. In my first year of university, I lived on the ground floor of a student housing block that was a cross, or an X shape, with the entrances being in the body of the building between the legs of the X. Each flat or apartment had 7 bedrooms and a kitchen/dining room at the end. My bedroom was the closest room to the main entrance to the building. As a result, I ended up with some really creepy encounters through my window. This was possibly the most bizarre and probably the closest I actually got to being hurt by someone, all through my own stupidity. When I was moving in, I noticed a good-looking Arabic guy moving into the flat next door. He was well-dressed, and his parents weren't helping what was clearly professional moving men as they put together the guy's room. They even appeared to unpack everything, too, as they took the boxes/packing items away with them. Anyway, there was a tearful goodbye from his mother, and his father patted him on the shoulder, and then they walked past me into the building. We nodded to each other. I noticed he wore a Free Palestine badge, which put me off because I don't understand enough about politics to get involved with that debate. A few months later, on a typical Thursday evening, the local bar had Vodka Thursdays, so it was a big night out for everyone. I had gone to bed around 1 a.m., only to be woken around 5 or 6 a.m. by an incessant banging on my window. It wasn't unusual, as I was the closest to the main entrance. I was constantly being woken up by students who had forgotten their keys or were too drunk to figure out the lock in the door. I went to open the door and realized he was carrying one of those hookah things. Once I opened the outside door, his flat door was literally 4 feet to the left of the main door. Mine, however, was around a twist in a corner internally. Expecting him to begin banging on his own door, I didn't turn around until I'd opened my own flat door, and then I went to shut it behind me. His hand trapped it and stopped it from shutting. I looked up at him, surprised, and he waved the hookah at me. "Have you got a light?" I happened to have some matches in the kitchen, so I told him to wait there, propping the door open, and went into my kitchen. Again he followed me into the flat. I handed him the matches and then motioned for him to leave, which he missed because he suddenly was very involved with lighting the damn thing in my kitchen. I stopped him and told him to go outside. He left the flat and I made sure to close the door behind him, going back to bed. I wasn't in bed for a second before the doorbell rang. Sighing heavily, I again dragged my tired ass out of bed and went to the door. "What do you want?" "I've lost my key to my flat. Can I stay here?" "No, go home. It's right over there." I shut the door. He rang the doorbell again. I opened the door. "Go away!" "Please, can I sleep in your room? I'll stay on the floor." "Hell no!" I again slammed the door. He leaned on the bell so it went off constantly. It was still 6 a.m. I opened the door. He put his foot inside. "What the hell, dude? Go home." "I don't want to make my flatmates." "But waking mine is okay? Fuck off." It was at this point the housemate who lived opposite me decided to step out of his room. He was a 6'3" Welsh rugby lad who really looked a lot like Biff in the Back to the Future series, but blonde. "Oi, what's happening here?" he growled. The guy from the next flat removed his foot from the door, put his hands up in surrender, then backed off. I finally got to shut the door, and he didn't ring the bell again. We watched, idly chatting about what had happened, as the guy went into the central staircase of the building and began to light his hookah with a lighter he produced from his pocket. Biff and I went back to our respective rooms, and I rang the porters because I was pissed off with the dude and wanted to make sure we didn't have a fire alarm in a matter of moments. The people on the phone were really nice, asked me if I was okay, and asked me what had happened exactly, and then while on the phone with them, my doorbell rang again. Seriously pissed off, I told them I could see it was the guy, and they asked to speak to him. I opened my door, told him there was someone on the phone trying to help him, and he took the phone in a totally normal, if a bit drunken manner. Once he was on the phone, however, his whole demeanor changed. "Who is this? Why are you phoning me? Who said you could tell me what I can do?" "No, I'm just talking to my friend. Who are you asking me this? Why do you need to know where I live or my name?" I was trying to reach for the phone But the guy was now holding the door almost shut on me, so I couldn't only fit my head, arm, and shoulder outside, and stretching his head away from me to prevent me from retrieving my phone. I know from experience that all they were doing was trying to run a check on the guy to be able to send someone to let him back into his flat. But he was having none of it. My flatmate Biff again heard the commotion at the front door and came to back me up, and managed to ram the door open, knocking the guy away and then scrambling for the phone. I apologized profusely to the phone operator, who told me to get inside my flat and stay inside my room and lock myself in there. They were sending someone to deal with the guy. My other flatmates had all woken up by this point and were standing with me in my room or in the corridor when a much calmer knock came at my window. The porters were just checking on me and asked for a statement. It was at this point they told me he didn't need letting into his flat because he had had his key on him the entire time. A week later, the father of the guy was back, as were the professional movers. Apparently, he had done something similar as he did to me to one of his own flatmates a few days later. Only this time, she had allowed him to sleep on her floor. Apparently, he didn't stay on her floor. She had screamed bloody murder until the other housemates had come to help. His dad had come to take him home in disgrace. His mother had not wanted to see her son for the shame. So creepy window-banging, hookah-smoking, doorbell-ringing guy, please let's not meet again. I'm a small, 21-year-old female from northern Ontario. I live on a fairly large plot of forest, in a small cabin-sized house with my husband and our 2 kids. My husband works about an hour away, and I stay home with our kids, who are 6 months and 2 years old. When this incident happened, it was midwinter and very cold and snowy. My husband had been storm-stayed at work because the plows had not been able to run the previous day. That isn't really unusual, given the remote area where we live. It was about 6 o'clock and already dark, and I was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner while my kids sat on the floor watching TV. There was a knock at the window beside where my kids were sitting. I look up and there was nothing there. I walked over to the window and glared out of it, the knife I had been washing in my hand. I had a bad feeling about this. The knock definitely sounded like one that was made by human knuckles on glass. But I saw nothing, and I guess I just kind of shook it off. Later that night, the knock came again, this time at my kids' window. I had had it, so I grabbed our shotgun from the locked gun cabinet and stepped out onto the porch in my pajamas and my husband's boots. I was so angry, I wasn't about to let someone fuck with my kids. I screamed, "I know you're out here, and if you don't fuck off and leave my babies alone, I swear to God I'll shoot you." And there was no answer. Nevertheless, I somehow knew there was still someone out there. So I cocked my gun and fired a round into the air so whoever it was would know I wasn't kidding around. Not the smartest or safest thing to do, I know, but what else could I have done? Besides, it worked. There was a rustling from around the side of my house, and a man ran off into the trees. Keep in mind, it's -30 degrees Celsius. I stood there for 5 minutes, making sure he didn't come back. Then I went in and called my husband and the police. The police were able to come out despite the weather, and looked everywhere around our house, and caught the asshole wandering through the woods about half a kilometer from our house. I don't know what happened to him after they arrested him, but he never came around again. So, creepy man who watched my kids and knocked on their windows, you'd best hope we don't meet again. When I was younger, I lived in the Midwest of Western Australia, one of the bigger towns along the coast, but small enough that people knew everyone, or heard about everything. My creepy encounter happened 10 or so years ago. Me and my family would spend our weekends going along the beach in the afternoons, getting some takeaway, and going fishing. I loved fishing, but I had an adventurous side and loved to go out and explore. The beach we had chosen to fish at was about 10 kilometers out of town, where big sand dunes met the ocean, and we had parked up a few kilometers to the furthest you could drive before the beach totally morphed into sand dunes. However, me being me, I decided to give fishing a break. Nothing was biting, so I went up to the sand dunes, which I would do most weekends. Just would roll around them like 15-meter razorbacks with steep faces. Nothing like it. My parents trusted me to not wander too far, and really there wasn't too much to worry about, being quite a quiet, friendly town. This one particular day still haunts me now, just thinking about what would happen if. After I had spent an hour rolling down these big sand dunes, I had noticed a man walking in the distance who would disappear and reappear as he ventured through the sand dunes. I didn't think much of it. You don't as a kid. It was common that people would go sandboarding or play in them like I did. At this point, I had become hungry and made the trek back to my family down on the beach. My mom and younger sister had set up a feed and Dad had taken a break from fishing. I can remember we had KFC. Back then it was a treat. After we had an early dinner, it was still daylight, by the way, we heard a noise in the sand dunes. It was a male voice. He was yelling what sounded like L. It got closer and closer, almost as if he was going to pop over the sand dune at any minute. However, it never happened, and we came to the conclusion this man was looking for his dog. As time went by, it started getting dark, so we decided to leave and went back home empty-handed without any fish. This is the part where it gets creepy. The next night on the local news, reports of a missing young woman, who my mom knew, had taken over all the news time, as something like this doesn't happen all the time. Details of the woman's disappearance began to emerge of where she had last been seen. I distinctly remember Mom's face as they read out the beach we had been to the day before, and around the same time. I was asked questions about what the man looked like, etc. I didn't see what the big fuss was, and all I could say was I saw a man walking. Both my parents went to the cop shop and gave statements about what they saw, what cars had driven past them while on the beach, what they had heard. I never understood the gravity of the situation. The next day or so, they found the missing woman, who had been brutally murdered and buried. It was around 1 kilometer away from where I had been playing that afternoon. The details of the attack are gruesome, and out of respect I'm not going to share them with you. As for the guy who was yelling L, it was the boyfriend of the woman. He had been out surfing just around the corner from us, and when he returned, she was missing, so he went looking. Her name starts with the letter L, which he used as a nickname. It makes me think that if I could have done something to help the woman, was the guy I saw the murderer? The haunting fact that what if the murderer had seen a 10-year-old kid by herself? The guy was caught and has just recently been linked with another murder around the same time, who was only 16. So much for quiet towns. Never know who you might bump into or come across. By the way, I was never allowed to play in the sand dunes alone again. I live in a small town in California, just 20 miles from the coast, and it's considered one of the safest and friendliest towns in the state. Crime is usually rare, besides the usual teens caught smoking weed or drinking alcohol, but what I experienced that night was an experience I will never forget. I am a 17-year-old male, recently graduated from school and soon going into college. Because it's summer, I finally have the rare chance and freedom to do whatever I want all day without worrying about schoolwork, and I also have the freedom to stay up all night if I want to. One day, my parents told me that they were going to leave the house in the morning and not come back until the next day, meaning I had the house to myself all day and night. My mom was getting surgery and was staying overnight, and my dad had decided to stay with her in the hospital. I was pretty excited that I had the house to myself for 24 hours, because I never did before. But what happened made me wish my parents were there. As usual, all I did was watch TV, play video games, and be unproductive all day. Basically my summer experience. When night rolled around, I was still playing Xbox until around 11 p.m., when things got weird. My family has 2 indoor cats. Both are extremely friendly Maine Coon cats, until something happens outside. Whenever there's a bird, raccoon, person, etc., they get excited and their feline instincts kick in, and they immediately rush to the window or start meowing or growling. They growl especially if someone's at the door. All this information will be relevant later. It was close to 11 at night when I was still on my ass playing Call of Duty. The noise volume was fairly low, so I heard a few taps coming from the general front door area, like light footsteps or small scrapes. My cat suddenly bolted from another room in the house. I paused the game and looked over, and saw my cats were walking around excitedly with their tails pointed up and their ears perched. Although my hair stood up as well, I simply dismissed the noise as a rat or a raccoon, either on the front yard or the roof, because we have so many and I hear them all the time, especially at night. I also was too engaged in my game to know where specifically the sound came from, so I just assumed the roof. A few seconds later, I returned to my game, although my cats were still clearly nervous and excited. I almost forgot about the sounds, and a few minutes later when I heard it again, this time louder, now sounding more like something hard shuffling across our stone-paved front yard from the front door area. My cats quickly sprinted to the window that overlooks the yard and started to meow excitedly and occasionally hiss. This time, I knew something was definitely there. I paused my game again and went over to the window where my cats were at to see what was out there. I expected a deer or a coyote, since rats cannot make that type of sound, and the noise only came from the outside door, not the roof. I peered out, but saw nothing, since it was very dark. Coming back to the television, I was a bit more creeped out. I decided I didn't want to play any more Xbox, since my hairs were standing up and shivers were spreading through my body. Besides, I've already played enough today. Being 6'4" and weighing 200 pounds, I felt like a dumbass and a pussy for being afraid of a deer. I decided I would brush my teeth and go to bed. Before I went into the bathroom, when I was just standing there thinking of all this, crazy shit happened. My cats heard it before me. Both of them ran to the front door, one of them growling like I'd never heard it before. A split second later, I heard it. Heavy shuffling footsteps right outside the door, and then another split second, the automatic lighting for the front porch turned on. Now this time I knew it was a person for sure. Only a human can make obvious footsteps like that. And the automatic lighting only turns on for big objects, like people. There was no knock or doorbell ring, but the front door is loose on its hinges, and if you slightly push it or nudge it, the door rattles. That is exactly what happened, and the rattle terrified me to the bone. Just knowing that I was home alone, in the dark except my TV screen, with footsteps and the automatic lighting turning on outside, gives me a feeling of terror that I will never forget. My cats were absolutely going crazy at this point, meowing, hissing, growling like crazy. Although every single muscle in my body told me to get away, curiosity that people get to look at terror and wonder got the better of me, and I quickly snuck to the door. If you enter my house, you would enter the mudroom, which is just a closet and a place to put shoes, and then would have to go to the right to a former doorway, without a door, to enter the living room, where I was. Also, my door is not a fully wooden door like most people have, but instead has decorative glass in the place where the panel should be. I snuck up to the mudroom and peered around the empty doorway, to indeed see through the glass a figure of a person standing there. I cleared my throat and mustered up the courage to ask, "Who's this?" No one answered. Now I asked, "Who are you?" The figure bent down and cupped his hands to his face and peered through the decorative glass. The terror swept me again, with my throat tightening and shivers spreading across my body because I was in shock. I hardly remember the facial features of the person, except that it was a thin-faced African-American guy. We stared at each other for a few seconds, and his expression turned into a scowl, like disappointment that I was home, and in a second this guy was gone. I could hear the fast-paced footsteps of shoes against stone as this guy ran off. About 15 seconds later, I heard a vehicle turn on and a screech of tires as he drove off. My terror turned into warm, sweet relief as I knew this guy was gone. My cats finally stopped acting so crazy, and just like two cute little kittens forgot about it, walked to whatever corner of the house, laid down, and started snoozing like nothing had ever happened. My theory of who this guy was and what he was doing is that he was scouting the neighborhood and looking for empty driveways so that he could somehow break into a house and steal whatever he could find. Since our car was gone and I was home alone, he probably thought that there was nobody home. I'm guessing the shuffling and light footsteps the first 2 times when I thought it was a rat or a deer was him hesitating or something. And on the 3rd time, he found the courage to look through the glass panel. Finally, when he heard me, he became curious and looked through the glass. However, when he saw me, he figured out he couldn't rob the place because I was there, so he bolted and drove away. Again, this is just my theory. I really have no idea who this guy was or what he was up to. The important thing is that I have never seen or heard of this guy again, and hopefully he'll never visit our house again.